Hi everyone, this is Olga Mack, building the future of contracts from home, and today I'm here with James. James, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is James Strange. I serve as an Associate General Counsel at a nonprofit based out of Southern California that specializes in energy advisory services and renewable energy and electric vehicle implementation.
Tell me a little bit more about your past before you got to this nonprofit and in your role. What were your other adventures in law?
It was kind of a weird path. I actually, my undergrad degree was in art with a focus in photography. I graduated in 2008, right at the beginning of that terrible economic downturn we had. So there wasn't a whole lot of jobs available. And I ended up at a solar company, a very large one. And it turned out that our territory at this company was the largest in the country, and it had the most authorities having jurisdiction within its territory, meaning that we had something like 70 cities, towns, and other municipalities within our territory in this company. And so my job at the solar company was to source things needed for solar installations, and it quickly became a very difficult job. Every AHJ required different things for these solar systems, and sometimes they were very difficult to source. And over time, I became curious, and it turned out that a lot of the reason for this utter disparity between how we install solar systems across these territories was largely policy related. Sometimes it was benign, the reasons for certain requirements. Sometimes it was less than benign. And when I began to get interested in sort of the reasons and the factors that influence, a tiny piece of energy policy that's as benign as, what kind of panels go where on what roof using what, the answer I was given by the company was, there are people working on that, don't worry about it. And I was bemoaning this to my supervisor one day, and he said, well, if you're really interested in stuff like that, you should just go to law school. And that kind of worked on me over a while. And so I started studying for the LSAT at night, and then took the test, and then one day applied to law school. And that's sort of how the journey began.
Wow. So you went to law school interested in energy.
Yeah. So energy policy and administrative law was actually sort of what motivated me to go to law school. And then I picked, of all the applications, the University of Hawaii. And the reason for that was because at the time, Hawaii was like at the center of this renewable energy argument that was happening regarding, behind the meter energy resources, solar panels on people's homes. By the time I went to law school, parts of Hawaii were reaching at, penetrations of at least, 30% of solar systems on homes versus overall. And the utility was fighting back very aggressively on this, making all sorts of arguments that it was dangerous for the grid, that it was a resource that they couldn't use, and that things needed to be calmed down before they could move forward. And of course, the renewable energy industry, especially the behind the meter solar installers, were pushing back hard as well. And everyone was facing both legal and technological challenges that had yet to sort of be addressed in 2014. And so it was a very fun place to go to law school and be interested in energy policy.
Yeah, I going to law school in Hawaii is probably a good place to go for many reasons. I used to work with a partner who chose a Ninth Circuit clerkship located in Hawaii for many reasons, including because he liked the judge, but also I think he liked the location.
Yeah, the Ninth Circuit clerkship in Hawaii is one of the most coveted positions. They get a lot of applications. Let's just go ahead.
I can only imagine why. It's all about the policy, I'm sure.
Yeah, it was a point of some consternation with us at the law school in Hawaii because we would apply for positions like that, and then you would have all of these top of the class Harvard graduates applying for the Ninth Circuit in Hawaii. But it's okay. Every now and again, one of us squeezed in.
That's true. Absolutely cannot go wrong with Hawaii. I also will say the same thing about California. where I'm located. But yes, Hawaii is up there. It's definitely a fantastic place to study or do anything really. So did you, when you were in law school, did you actually have it, how was your ability to actually study and acquire energy law related skills? Was it everything you planned or not quite?
Yeah, actually, it went better than I could have hoped for. I was very lucky in that year. They hired a professor to actually run sort of. It wasn't an official clinic, but they hired a professor to specialize in energy law. And me and this professor and a couple other students actually started what we called the Energy Justice Program. And so we were very involved in the community as much as we could be. So while we were there, we hosted some community events where we were discussing, the role of the utility and how the role of the utility might change. And we were there to get feedback from the community. At the time, everything was going on there in 2014, 2015. There was an outside energy company called NextEra that was very interested in purchasing Hawaii Electric Company. And it was a very big deal for the state because the state of Hawaii essentially only has one major investor-owned utility in its territory. And so we went into the community to solicit feedback on not only the merger, they were calling it, but what the community felt about energy and energy policy. And then we also went to the island of Molokai, gave a presentation to a community board and held a workshop about, what it might look like for the island of Molokai to, use a little bit of eminent domain power through the county and become their own utility. Also heavily, involved in what the legislator was doing and studying the laws and policies that were taking place in Hawaii and abroad. So, I thought it was a great experience. It gave me a lot of opportunity to not only, sit in the library and do mountains of research, but actually get out into the community and hear from people, what expectations they had for their energy and what they would like to see moving forward.
I've never had conversations with people about their expectation about energy. That must have been, that's a very interesting way of describing it. I guess, what was the most surprising thing when you had conversation with folks in the community about their expectations of energy?
I think the thing that surprised me most is that, like you just said, not a lot of people have given thought to it. Right? They turn on the light switch and the light comes on. And it's very, very rare that you turn on the light switch and nothing happens. And so people don't think about it very much on a day-to-day basis. But when you bring them into a room and you give them like a 5-minute presentation on where electricity comes from, how it's regulated, and what do you think we should do with, our energy resource mix, and where should power plants go? Should they go in your backyard? How many solar panels should we have versus how many natural gas plants, et cetera? It surprised me. People very, very quickly will tell you they think electricity is an essential commodity and that it should be treated democratically and that the community should have a voice, and not only how it operates, but how it's owned and it should be fair. And so, to sum it up, people tend to look at it like we would the police force or firemen. It's something that should be provided at an affordable rate for everybody, is the short answer.
Very interesting. I have not been part of conversations like this. It sounds like it should be part of a larger community discourse and decision making that is much more inclusive because it is, to some extent, a fundamental right. And we sort of, at Parleyport, we have seen that access to internet during crisis has been, and which is kind of a utility to, an example of one, is a great predictor of how a person or a company or organization has been able to weather storm. If you had stable internet, your chances of being connected and productive during crisis have been exponentially higher than for those people who haven't. And unfortunately, that is often correlated with income and other things. And I've heard a number of conversations about kind of access to internet as something that is kind of a basic right, because it really allows you to continue living a normal life.
I would absolutely agree with that. I mean, if you are to look at a stable, high functioning, complicated economy, I think the internet has become an essential part of that, and access to the internet therefore becomes a very, very important issue. But of course, without electricity, there's no internet, there's no lights, there's no way for people to actually participate in, what we would consider a developed world economy, right? So, those are all very, very important questions. And unfortunately, the way that electricity is historically regulated in the U.S., it doesn't really lend itself to community level conversations, right?
So let's talk about, I'm actually very novice to this. I know about a lot of things, but energy I actually don't know much about, and definitely don't know much about energy law. And I'm sure that's a combination of all kinds of laws and regulation and administrative decisions. But maybe at a high level, explain to someone who is generally intelligent, but maybe electricity not as sophisticated, how energy and electricity are regulated.
Sure. So like you said, this is sort of a black hole. I'll try to keep it high level, and I apologize to any of your listeners if I oversimplify things or misspeak a little bit here in trying to weave a simple narrative. But essentially, at the turn of the century, there was a milieu of industrial actors out there creating electric grids, right? They were like putting up a dam or building a generation station, and they were just running wires everywhere. And it quickly became apparent that some central planning needed to be involved. But the argument from industry was, it's very expensive and time consuming to invest all of this infrastructure and then have no guaranteed rate of return. So the sort of business relationship that began to develop, between 1910 and 1920s was certain corporations would be handed a franchise to operate in a certain area. And they would be guaranteed a certain rate of return, and in exchange, they would be regulated by the state. And so what sort of popped up across the United States was each state formed their Public Utilities Commission or an equivalent that granted monopolies to certain corporations in certain territories. So for some states that were small, you might have one utility who is tasked with the electricity delivery in the entire state. Other much bigger states like California or New York, there was a mixture of utilities who were kind of given pieces of the state to operate in. And that basically worked with some major tweaks along the way around FDR. For 80, 90 years, it went for a long time, and these IOUs were very entrenched. And but then things started to change a little bit in the 70s with the oil embargo. And it turned out that our electric infrastructure was extremely reliant, on foreign oil imports and coal. And there was a lot of conversation that started to take place then about, how vulnerable are we? And so some changes started to come along at the federal level regarding, how we regulate the utilities and what resource mix we want them to have. How variable is our grid? How strong is it in terms of like being able to lose a certain resource, and then all of a sudden you have the other technologies cropping up like wind and solar, and which were sort of challenging this top-down ownership model of vertically integrated utilities. Vertically integrated meaning the utility would procure the resource, generate the electricity, transmit the electricity, and also deliver it to your home. That sort of business model has been heavily challenged throughout the United States. I would argue since like the 90s. But again, there's lots of branches on this tree I just planted in front of you, so I'm not sure which one you want to go down.
No, that's a really good picture, and I guess maybe what would be helpful, clearly there's a model that is in place, it's very ingrained. It also has challenges. It has been challenged. I guess maybe let's talk about the challenges. What challenges does this create for the market, for the community, for the regulators, for the future? Lots of aspects. would love to hear about.
Sure. Well, I guess one thing, the white elephant in the room, I guess, and discussing any sort of energy policy at the state level or the community level, is that electricity is transmitted, and it's a commodity. So as soon as it leaves state lines, it's subject to federal government regulation, right? And so, I mentioned FDR earlier. Around the time of the Great Depression, all of or a great many of the electric utilities across the United States were owned by holding companies. And these holding companies were often not in the states that they owned the utilities in. And when the Great Depression happened, many of these holding companies experienced financial difficulties. A lot of them went under. Service rates, their ability to safely manage their grids was greatly compromised. And they were arguing that they shouldn't be subject to state regulations. The federal government stepped in with the Federal Power Act and said, holding companies were limited to owning just a few utilities, and they had to be in one state. And a sort of equilibrium happened there between what the states were allowed to regulate with their utilities, which was essentially mostly prices, planning, infrastructure, and what the federal government was allowed to regulate, which was the transmission of electricity across state borders. That evolved over time, and now a lot of our electric grids are in these sort of huge transmission operator organizations, and they also set prices at like a federal, interstate level with auctions. I feel like I got a little lost here in the details.
No, those are really great details, and it makes sense because it's a very complicated area of law and policy, and and because and there are a lot of cooks in the kitchen. Not only across time, but also between the states and communities and federal government. You end up with a combination of all kinds of things. And so if you were to identify maybe the top 2 or 3 challenges now that we've had this for a little while and different people try to patch it up and address and do the best they can under the circumstances, what maybe are the top 2, 3 challenges that we face today?
Understood. Okay. I think that's a great way to frame this. So I think the first is as states adopt more environmentally friendly policies. For example, many states have implemented a renewable portfolio standard of 100% renewable energy in their state by usually 2045, 2050 is the bar that they set. And as those states reach to be net zero in their emissions, how do we make sure that the grid is able to provide electric service, cheaply and reliably, while mainly sourcing its electricity from sources like wind and solar and geothermal, hydro, things of that nature. I think the second great issue is technology evolves as solar becomes cheaper, as batteries become cheaper, and businesses and homeowners want to, adopt these energy solutions for themselves because it results in cheaper electricity. How do we allow that to happen? Give people the freedom and choice to adopt, energy to their liking, while making sure that we retain the integrity of the local grids. And I think the third issue there is, what impact will these changes that states are making have on the larger electric grid on a national level? And to what degree should the federal government have any say on pricing controls and resource adequacy concerns as we transition to renewable energy?
Interesting. So renewable energy really adds something to this mixture and completely changes the conversation. And it sounds like in the future, it may change everything.
Yeah, well, I mean, the most states are reliant for their electricity on resources such as coal or natural gas. That sort of makes the baseline, adequacy reliance that runs through the United States electric grid, as it's a combination of all these 50 grids in these states. Most rely, including California, for major parts of the year on natural gas. So, what is it going to look like as we attempt to fade out this resource and adopt more wind, more solar? It's going to take technologies such as batteries to sort of take the place of a lot of these resources, because as I'm sure your listeners are aware, sometimes the wind is not always blowing and sometimes the sun is not always shining. So, how do we capture this electricity, store it, and make sure it's available for times when we need it most? And that's also a very complicated conversation. So we can tease that out a little bit, or we can go in a different direction.
Yeah, well, actually, let's do that. And then before we do that, maybe just so we're definitionally on the same page, let's define renewable energy so we know exactly what it is. And then, yes, let's talk about options.
Sure. So of course, you're an attorney, so I think you hit on a very salient point there. And of course, renewable energy is a little bit different depending on how your jurisdiction decides to define it. But for me, renewable energy means we have not burned any oil or coal or released any carbon into the atmosphere in obtaining that energy resource, right? So without parsing semantics, essentially, solar would be renewable energy, wind, hydroelectric, perhaps geothermal in some instances. These are all resources that once they're in place and begin to generate electricity, there's no emitting CO2 or other gases in the equation of the energy capture.
Okay, and so for the renewable energy to fit in this mix and really be part of our future, a much easier to breathe future, what needs to happen?
Well, I think there needs to be changes towards, how we plan for resource adequacy, and to make sure that there's continued pressure and focus on solving the issues that we have in front of us. For example, California during January to March, and from March to essentially before the summer begins. So let's say from March through May, California actually has a vast amount of extra electricity on its grid. 50% of the grid's electric mix is coming from solar and wind. And because those tend to be temperate months in California, no one's blasting their AC, no one's running their heater. All of that electricity is just sort of wasted. Some of it gets stored, some of it gets transmitted out of the state to people who need it. But a lot of it is curtailed, meaning they just shut off the system because there's so much electricity available that there are negative price signals, and it doesn't help anybody. So as we start to transition more towards renewable energies, we're going to have to get very serious about how we capture that electricity, where it's stored, and how it's activated. Because right now a lot of the grid, I can speak to California, is when we have emergency times, like everyone's running their ACs because they're in a heat wave. That electricity is usually met with gas peaker plants, which are these sort of small specialized plants that are very expensive to operate, that kick on at a moment's notice virtually and start delivering extra power to the grid. And simultaneously, those are also the most emissions heavy solutions to providing extra electricity. So I think we're going to have to be very careful about the price signals that we set, and how we plan our infrastructure moving forward.
So is technology there to capture that excess, that surplus? I guess that's a big our ability to solve this problem has to be met with our capabilities, technologically speaking. So is that something that sort of we are getting close to, or is that something that is actually entirely available and to some extent commoditized?
Understood. I think that the technology is there. The technology actually is almost always there. We got to the moon in 9 years or whatever it was. I think that the second part of that question is how much is it going to cost, right? And that really is the sort of the fulcrum that weighs the scale here. So it's been said, I don't have the source in front of me, that the United States is going to need about $1.5 trillion over the next 20 years to update and modernize its grid, because parts of it are falling apart in places. And so if we're going to be making that heavy investment, what should the investment mean? Where should it go? What should we invest in our resources? And in terms of price signals, most of the IOUs, and Hawaii is proving this to be very true, but California IOUs are, when I say IOU, I mean investor-owned utilities, are procuring contracts where they're putting in solar farms and batteries to sort of replace what the gas peaker plants were doing. And they're doing it at prices that are similar. And so as you encourage and adopt more of these solutions, the prices are going to come down. And we know the prices are coming down with solar, with battery technology. And then there are also novel solutions that people are looking into. So there are less known things like flywheels, which are sort of a form of energy storage. There's pumped hydro, which people are exploring. There's also a very novel company that is storing energy with automated systems that build large towers. And then when you need electricity, they drop the blocks and it generates electricity as the blocks fall. So I think there's definitely going to be some growing pains, and there's going to be some sort of contraction and flexing as we discover which technological solutions work best for the grid that we have and the grid that we want. But I would argue that the technology is there.
Very interesting. I would find often that technology may be there. There's sort of concerns about price. There's also people don't like changing behavior, and they don't like changing institutions, and change sometimes takes a while, especially in law policy, and communities that may or may not be educated. So those are kind of the reasons for not embracing the 21st century often quickly enough. So can we truly achieve the sort of net zero carbon electric grid? Is it possible? Is it possible in our lifetime? What do you think?
I think it's possible in our lifetime. Sometimes I get wide eyes when I say that, but people tend to forget that the electric grid wasn't just here one day. It didn't just come into being, and unfortunately, we weren't given the benefit, if we're less than 100 years old, of seeing its development and evolution in our society over the past 100 years. There was a lot of law and policy and price signals that were encouraged during that time to make sure that the grid developed in a certain way and relied on a certain amount of resources, certain kind of resources. So as we look to the future, as we need to update and modernize our grid, as we understand the deleterious effects of emitting CO2 for our energy and our transportation, it's sort of incumbent on us to make sure that we can do it. But to more directly answer your question, for instance, in California, our baseline load, meaning the amount of electricity that needs to be available on the grid at all times to sort of meet California's base energy needs, a lot of that is met by natural gas. And so we're going to have to figure out how to sort of replace these base load requirements that California needs with renewable options. For example, we have a goal in California of 100% RPS by 2045, I believe. Someone can slap me if it's actually 2050. And renewable portfolio standards come with their own definitions and requirements. I think we can get mostly there. I think it's very possible. The state towards the end might explore certain things like carbon sequestration to kind of meet their net zero goals. There might be some sort of carbon energy exchange, like we participate in now with other states and nations. We might be emitting a little bit of gas still at the end, but I think if we do it right, we can get almost there.
I love it. Let's talk about your journey. You started in photography, found yourself accidentally at a solar company, now knee deep in this policy and nonprofit, and really in the midst of this conversation of future of energy. What makes you get up in the morning and still want to be part of it?
Really, it's the overarching challenge of climate change. Globally, about 1/3 of our carbon emissions are due to electric generation. And I think we would all agree that electricity is sort of now woven into the fabric of our society and economy. It's not something we can just dump overboard and try over again. And so, if we want to make a real impact on minimizing the amount of CO2 gets into the air, we have to, explore renewable energy options. That's not easy because we're dealing with 100-year-old infrastructures, 100-year-old entrenched company systems and regulatory oversight. And so it's not something that's where you can just sort of implement market signals and then sit back and wait for the evolution of the resource and of the infrastructure. It takes very targeted sometimes and very active policy making to get these favorable changes moving forward, to get the momentum. And I think we have a lot of great momentum now. I mean, despite changes that have taken place at the federal level, most states have taken charge and are actively trying, even in what would be considered very conservative jurisdictions that are maybe more skeptical of phasing out fossil fuels as a resource mix. We see these states taking like definite policy initiatives to not only transition towards more renewable energy, but also adopt more electric infrastructure for vehicles. So I'm positive, but the work isn't done. It's not going to be done for a very long time, and you can't take a step back from it really. So I've been very encouraged by what I've seen since I've gotten involved in this policy environment in 2014. But it's not easy, and there are going to be hiccups. So that's what motivates me.
I love it. This is the work that has to be done. That's what makes you get up in the morning. I think that's such a good answer. It's always fun to be part of building and creating. And it's probably the most satisfying place to be because you're not going to inherit the system. You're sort of part of building it. And you have a little bit of, I guess, control as to where that may go, or at least input. So what if you are, a young lawyer, or actually maybe a lawyer who in the midst of career, who wants to either have an impact or maybe even pivot into this clearly very important for our future of humanity area of law and frankly energy generally. Where do I start if I have this interest?
That's difficult because it is very niche, and there are I would consider limited avenues. But if you're motivated and this is really your passion, there's also a lot of opportunity. I guess if you were a law student, I would recommend you dig into environmental and administrative law courses. Most of the energy world is regulated by state or federal agencies, and the interplay between federal and state energy law, on a commerce clause level is very, very important to how energy is created and planned in the United States. And then likewise, the way that energy is regulated, the relationship that state agencies have with the private owned companies that generate and transmit electricity in the state, that relationship is also very administrative law heavy. So being good at that, really understanding, the arbitrary and capricious standards that exist out there, I think is one step. I think the second step would be, try and work at a utility maybe. If you are nearby your state's Public Utilities Commission, intern there. Lots of public utility commissions actually have internships during law school for interested grads. And, having a JD is very valuable for a lot of the work that utilities commissions do, even if you're not doing strict lawyer work. So that's a great way to get invested. And also, the nonprofit NGO world is also a great place to start. While they might not be doing direct energy policy and regulation, a lot of the things that they do will touch that. And you'll have an opportunity to get good at it and to dig your fingers in.
I love it. Those are great advice. I guess maybe I'm getting close to finishing this conversation. I think what really left a big impression on me is sort of the lack of education in the community, um, and the importance of energy for the community, and maybe how to close that gap, and what we as lawyers or law students or policymakers, regulators, elected officials, what can be done, to, educate the community and help us all make decisions that are sustainable and help us all thrive.
Got it. Yeah, that's a hard one. And I think, energy planning and energy, resources for a lot of us are esoteric because it's handled at the state level. There's typically a state public utilities commission that sort of holds proceedings and engages the utilities in these very like rigid quasi-judicial, environments, and it's difficult for the public at large to penetrate. That's changing a little bit, but I think what's really important is that you make sure you vote for people who are going to, support your policy, energy initiatives, and who have energy on the mind. I'd recommend when you research your elected officials, make sure that they have a energy environment, place on their page. Of course, who the governor is very important because the governor appoints public utilities commissions commissioners, and they serve at his pleasure in many respects. So that will have an effect on energy policy in the state. But what's also important to remember is that unlike California, the governor appoints commissioners, but in some states the commissioners are voted in. And so, for instance, in Arizona this election, I believe there are several commissioners up for a vote. So what those commissioners say they're going to do and what they believe in and what they want to try and do is very important. And as a voter, you can have a direct impact on Arizona's energy development moving forward. I think that's where you start at a high level. On the next tier, there are a lot of laws and regulations in place in most states to prevent people from getting too liberal with how they generate electricity and transmit it. A lot of that's for safety reasons, but a lot of that was also implemented to sort of cement the utilities monopoly. So I think if you want communities to begin to become more prescient about their energy choices and actually, move forward in democratizing, energy in their area, there's actually going to have to be some legal barriers that are removed to allow that to happen in a safe and interesting way.
James, I've learned so much in the last 40 minute conversation, that I haven't learned in quite a while. So thank you for those insights and lessons and sharing your journey. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and I hope to do it again.
Yeah, no problem. I hope it wasn't, hope you're not just being polite.
I'm not polite. If you know me well enough, I am as direct as they come. So no, it was fantastic. It was very educational. And I'm certain that my listeners and viewers will find it likewise. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.